Today's question is, do Christians have to tithe? My guess is that what's behind this is not just a question about whether Christians should give anything to invest into their churches and into other ministry, but is really about how much to give. There's a lot of people that use the language of tithing, and some people will use that as like a 10% standard of income. And so let's talk through what is the history of tithing, where does that come from in the Bible, and where do we see the clearest principles? Well, in the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant, the tithing actually could include three separate sets of giving that the Israelite people were required, and that those totals could reach 23 to 30% when they were all added together. So my guess is that most people in churches aren't quite ready to give that kind of a contribution. In the New Testament, there's actually only one passage that talks about tithing explicitly, and that's in Luke's gospel when Jesus confronts the Pharisees and says to them, you tithe even your mint and your cumin, but they had missed the heartbeat of God's gospel and his work and justice. And so giving the 10% as a hard line actually misses the heartbeat of both the Old and New Testaments, and can feel more like we're trying to be in a transactional relationship with God, of saying, what is the bare minimum that we have to give in order to receive his blessing? And that stands against the gospel itself. So in the New Testament, the passage that speaks most clearly and most fully of what it looks like for the church and principles for Christians in churches as far as the contributions that they give, it comes out of 2 Corinthians, the 8th and 9th chapter of that book. And in that letter, Paul talks about a mission for Titus, that Titus is coming to receive the Corinthians' contribution. And he holds up the Macedonian church as a model for giving, that they were sacrificial in their giving and gave out of extreme poverty, and was calling the wealthier Corinthian church to contribute as well. Which there's a reality that's continued today, that in the American church, we see that the poor give proportionally much more than the rich. Now, in that passage, we see 6 principles that Paul gives us for giving. And so you can take some time to read it. I'm not going to take the time in this short video to read that passage, but the principles you'll see are, I think, pretty clear. He begins by saying, plan ahead. In chapter 8, verses 10 and 11, that in the reality is we're unlikely to drift into generosity. So he talks about the plans that they had made and to fulfill the plans they had made for giving. And that's true of anything in our lives, and certainly in our spiritual lives, that if we're going to develop in prayer, we need to plan to pray. If we're going to give to God's work, we need to make plans that way and then pursue those plans. The second principle is to work toward an expansive heart. And what God is looking for is a desire to give. He knows our hearts, and so start there. The passage talks about the passions within us and the emotion to work toward a goal. And so in 8:12 and in chapter 9, verse 5, it talks about our heart and our heart's posture in giving. And so we need to understand that the biblical model for generosity and giving is that it's not supposed to be begrudging. It's not supposed to be just out of requirement. It really should be seen as a service and as a privilege, as an opportunity to join God in his work. And within that, as we work on an expansive heart, it's also important that as we give, that those who are able to give, and particularly those who are able to give very larger amounts of gifts and generously, that also doesn't get used as a manipulation to try to control what's happening in the local body. The third principle is be a model to others. And so there's in chapter 9, verses 1 and 3, he encourages the Corinthian church to in the example that's been provided, and says, this is what has been done, and now here's what you can be and what you should work toward. And he shows how even whole churches can encourage and push entire churches and to model what generosity looks like. He also talks about being seen to be clean, and so he has a whole plan with Titus on here's who's going to handle the money and here's where it's going, and it's important that churches understand that and serve as a model for what fiscal responsibility looks like as they handle the money. And so in all of that, Christians and churches should work to be a model for others in how to handle money in the household of God and how to do so generously. The fourth principle, so we plan ahead and work toward an expansive heart, we're a model to others, and the fourth is to be an encouragement to leaders. Churches are called to take care of their leaders. 1 Corinthians 9 talks about that, and 2 Corinthians 9, 4 and 5 talk about that churches are supposed to take care of their leaders and not just keep their leaders humble and poor, but care for them in a way that their leaders can be freed to do the work of ministry and be generous themselves. And in that, I've got to say, as a pastor, and not just for the pastors on staff, but our elders and our staff team and our leaders and even our community group leaders, that the leadership community of Redemption Hill is hugely encouraged when our people give sacrificially and generously. We are hugely encouraged when the resources are provided to do the work that we feel like God has called us to in this place. So the fifth principle then is to be someone who gives out of generosity and grace and gratitude. This shows up in 2 Corinthians 9, 6 to 11. That verse 6 out of context could feel like it was transactional with God, but the focus here is on motive. It's not a mechanical return, but it says that the Lord loves a cheerful giver, and that the return is all God's grace. This is His universe, and He is able to make all grace abound to us, so that in all things, at all times, we would have all that we need, and we would abound in the ultimate harvest for us is righteousness. And then sixth, and finally, is that as we give, we should be focused on God's praise. And so it's right to understand the horizontal needs. We've talked about a lot of that, of providing the needs for God's people. But all of that should ultimately flow into thanksgiving. The way that we give shouldn't draw attention to individuals, but really it should draw attention to God. And in corporate giving, it's totally appropriate to celebrate what happens within the church as resources are provided, because that's a reflection of the work God has done in His people's hearts to provide for the work. And so we need to be aware of the interdependence of the body of Christ, and how sometimes we'll be in positions to be those who give, and sometimes we'll be in positions that we are the ones that need to receive. And in that, Paul talks about it as an inexpressible gift, that it's too precious to be spoken. And so thanks be to God for this inexpressible gift. And so as we think about tithing at Redemption Hill, we ask our members to give of their time, their talents, and their treasure in ways that are sacrificial and joyful and generous. For some people, 10% of their income in a hard tithe would be a huge sacrifice and make it impossible to live in this city. For other people in our church, 10% might be a starting point, and they may have the ability to be generous beyond that. But the key in it all is the heart posture we have as we get to join God in His work, and one aspect of that is giving. So I hope that helps to understand tithing and how New Testament principles on giving a little more clearly. If you have a question, please submit it on the website. We're happy to ask anything that comes in, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.